Hey there! Thanks for tuning into Duckworks. I'm Chris and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, the show where I review every single canonized fan-created Bionicle model. Some of these were made for the Rahi and Dark Hunter contests in 2005, and others were made for the more recent TTV canonization contests, which are actually still ongoing. This model in particular is the Tunnel Stalker, and the circumstances of its canonization are actually pretty unique. So back when the Rahi contest was being held, this was not actually a part of it, but this was canonized from the Bionicle Encyclopedia. You see, the administrator of the largest and best Bionicle wiki, Biosector01, asked Greg Farshty if he could include a photo of the Tunnel Stalker in the Bionicle Encyclopedia to canonize it, and Greg was able to make it happen. And that is a pretty unique story because no other model has really been canonized like that other than this particular one. So the Tunnel Stalker here is one of the Rahi native to Pometru and Pokoro. It employs a specialized technique where it burrows deep underground, hence tunnels, and then jumps out onto the surface using its specialized tail to paralyze any prey. It's a pretty simple concept for a model, but this is honestly one of the better looking Rahi, especially when it's all put together. But so let's just move on from story and sum up the points by which I review these models. Number one is posability, which means can it hold the weight of its own body? Can you get it into cool poses and whatnot? Number two is building techniques. So is this just reusing stuff from the sets, or is it actually trying to do something new? Number three is overall aesthetics, so agnostic of its role in the story. Does this look cool? Does it look menacing? Does it look like a realistic animal? And number four is finally believability in universe. So does this make sense as a Rahi creature in the Bionicle world, and does it scale well next to other Rahi and many other denizens of the Matoran universe? With those out of the way, let's just jump right into the review studio and take a look at the Tunnel Stalker.
Alright, so here we have the Tunnel Stalker model in all its glory. You can see that immediately some aspects of it, I will have to note, are not 100% the correct colors, mostly just different shades of brown or tan in the interior workings, but for the most part, every single piece in this model should more or less be the right color and exactly what it should have been. So, this is the Tunnel Stalker. It's one of the most complex and involved Rahi from the Canon G1 storyline. Of course, it was submitted by a fan for the Bionicle Encyclopedia, which means that it has a pretty unique canon status, but let's just start things off with posability. Now, obviously, this is not your traditional Rahi, so it's not like a bipedal Rahi or something that we've seen before. It's more of a scorpion-esque animal, which means that it has these clawed legs, pincers up in the front, and even a fully ratcheted tail. Let's start there because this is the simplest part of it to showcase. So, the tail is featuring ratchet joints, which can be moved up and down on pretty much every degree that you would expect, so you can really get this angled backwards, angled forwards, and so on. Kind of pose the tail up in multiple different positions, and all of these are all click hinged, so that should be pretty easy to work with. On the tip of the tail, you've got this whole aspect here, so it's kind of a pair of pincer blades or claws, so you can imagine that it is, say, maybe having it in an open position to grab prey, and then snapping shut to grab whatever it's hunting. It's almost very, very similar to the Bionicle G2 Skull Scorpio. In fact, its tail had pretty much the exact same look. It was this open grabber piece, and then you could use these to close the tail to snatch up prey, so kind of a funny similarity there. Of course, moving on, you can also rotate each of the joints because they are the standard click hinge joints that featured in some of the 2003 era Titan sets. And then we can probably move on to the rest of it. So the head right here, unfortunately, cannot actually move. So the head is not actually mounted on a ball joint whatsoever. You can wiggle it around a little bit because there's some flex in the movement here, but for the most part, you can't really do much with the head itself. So that is that. Let me just really get it reattached here. The head is pretty much just fixed right on here. The claws, however, actually do have a pretty good degree of motion. If you look at it at almost a top-down view right here, you'll notice that they're mounted on double sets of ball joints, which added an extra amount of friction in the movement, so you can really bend these in any which way you want. And then the forward claws themselves actually are fully articulatable. Unfortunately though, if your joints are maybe a little bit old or worn out, the claws will tend to sag down. Specifically, the large weight on this claw makes it really hard to keep it upright. If you really kind of try to angle it on stuff, you can do it, but if you just have it in a straight position, it will just fall down like so. Thankfully though, the claws also have an actual pincing motion, so you've got this opening and closing like actual claws on a scorpion. These are pretty beefy things, and sometimes if you're not careful with it, they will fall out because they use the older style of ball joint, but it's not really a huge problem, and it's pretty easy to fix as well. So you can see you can really clamp that shut here. Works just the same way for the other claw. And then we can move on to the other aspects of this build. So the legs themselves are pretty simple. You just have them mounted on these standard Rakshi limb pieces. If you look closely, they are just Rakshi limbs, just highly edited because in modified. So you've got this whole bottom piece right here, which prevents you from angling it down far enough to really capture the curve of the leg, which I do appreciate because this does help a bit with support. Obviously a free moving joint at the end here, and then on the top of it you've actually got this interesting L-shaped Technic bracket. This is specifically there to prevent the back leg from moving forwards too much. You can see how it's stopping the movement there, and also to prevent the front leg from moving up too high because this piece kind of gets in the way of that. It's not the best way of doing things, and honestly that exposed pin is a little bit awkward to me, but it does the job alright, and definitely prioritize stability and making sure you could actually pose the legs over any sort of aesthetics for this particular aspect of it. So the back leg is built pretty much the same way. It's literally just using some different pieces. Let me put this claw back on here, which again, as you can see, just fell right off, but the back leg here is just another Rakshi leg. You've got one of the other dark orange Technic segments here to really keep it in place, and then bending the leg here, you'll notice that you just have an extra Mata foot piece with a nicely armored Parak shield element here to really make it feel fully armored up. Now the inclusion of the Mata head also does give a little bit more detail to this leg, and at least sets it apart from the front leg, which is again basically the same build but detailed slightly differently. And that is honestly all there is to say about articulation. There's a few other things you can kind of bend around on the model, but it's really not that intentional. And there are a few things that are a little bit fragile with it if you're not super careful with how you're playing with it. For instance, you've got this brown hose right here that really is just kind of loose and out on its own. You can see you can kind of just rotate this every which way, but you kind of just have to line it up with the pieces here and hope it stays in place like so. So there's a few things like that where you just kind of have to mess around with the angles to make sure it works, but all in all, it is a fairly cohesive model because you can very clearly see exactly what this model is supposed to be. Some sort of a scorpion-like Rahi. Now one question you may have is, can this actually hold its own weight? And the answer is not really. Basically no. Maybe if you really mess with it, you can get it to be off the ground with the legs upwards like so, but it's not going to be great, and of course your claws are just going to droop back down anyways. So really you just kind of have to rest on the ground. That being said, I honestly don't mind it too much, at least compared to many other models, because this is not a bipedal creature. It's not a creature that does not look good unless it's standing straight up off the ground. Having the body of this rest on the ground makes it look perfectly fine, and honestly, you wouldn't even notice it if you just looked at the front. It almost looks like it's slightly elevated off the ground. So not a huge deal to me. Obviously, it would have been nice to actually have the legs support the weight of this creature just for play and in-universe reasons, but if you just look at the model as a whole, it doesn't look half bad, and if you ignore the fact that it can't actually raise itself off the ground, it's not a huge deal where this model is concerned. But then let's move on to building techniques. So building techniques I do want to call out. There's nothing in this model that is just ripped from an existing LEGO set. Really everything about this is completely unique, and one of the coolest parts was figuring out exactly how the body went together. If if you look at the underside here, it uses a very interesting combination of Tohunga feet of all things, as well as some of the Rahaga feet or Borok feet right here, as well as just some other random pieces just held together, some of which are literally even held together by the Lego wand pieces or the flex hose pieces just strung in between particular joints and anchored in place. It uses some very surprisingly innovative building techniques for what's basically just a Rahi built around the 2004-2005 era, and that really impressed me with just how sophisticated the torso came together. Even moving on to the top of the body here, you can see that everything is pretty much fully armored up. You've got these Tohunga feet adding additional armor, making it look like they're stretching outwards to the back legs, and of course you've got the dark orange tubes that snake throughout the body and are anchored in by the feet elements, which makes it all come together pretty well. Now, besides just a few empty sockets on the tail, which I'm not really sure why those are there, pretty much every piece here has a purpose and a role to play, which is something I really do appreciate about this model. It does feel like a very cohesive Rahi. And of course, speaking of cohesion, we should probably move on and talk about aesthetics. Now, here's where I really want to mention the head, because that's not something I have brought up too often in the review thus far, but as we move into aesthetics, I do want to note that the head features an excellent combination of different pieces that really work together to achieve a very cohesive looking head. You've got Borok shields, Borok feet, Rakshi shells, and other Borok shields acting as teeth on the front here, and somehow everything feels like it works together and feels like a very cohesive head. Now, if only you could actually move it around, that would be really nice, but unfortunately you're kind of stuck with this fixed position. Even the claws themselves are using very unique pieces, such as the Pohatu Mata torso pieces right here. If you didn't notice that, they're really built around these large body pieces that actually do feel like they are part of the claws. And it's using these pieces in very innovative ways that complement the aesthetics very well. Moving onwards to the back here, I like the fact that you can really choose to splay out the tail, imagining that this is burrowing through the ground, maybe a longer styled creature like an insect, and of course you can move it upwards to strike, which also looks really good in my opinion. Moving on to the legs, sure, they're just standard Rakshi legs, but at least they actually have a lot of very unique things going for them, which really makes this build stand apart, at least aesthetics-wise, compared to many other builds out there. And finally, just talking about the model as a whole, again, I can very clearly see what this is supposed to represent. Some sort of a scorpion-like insectoid creature, which is quite a good job. But now I think we can probably move on from that point and talk about how this model compares to other representative samples from the Bionicle G1 universe. Let's go.
Alright, so here is the Tunnel Stalker Rahi alongside some other representative samples. I've brought alongside the Nui Jaga, who basically is also a scorpion-like creature, Toali Khan, who's just a standard Toa-sized hero for scale, alongside the Matoran Eerie, who's just a Matoran for scale, and another insectoid Rahi, in this case the Metru Mantis. So as you can see, the Tunnel Stalker is quite large, but it doesn't necessarily dwarf the other heroes or characters. It really does feel like a semi-realistic Bionicle creature, because there definitely are some that are much larger than this. In terms of the way it's built, I really do like the inclusion of lots of Technic pieces throughout, which really kind of call back to the original Bionicle 2001 Rahi, just like the Nui Jaga Scorpion here. And in terms of how he scales next to a Matoran, I can definitely see this working out fairly well. It certainly is a large creature, but many of the Rahi are quite large in the Bionicle universe, so it definitely does make sense to me. So in terms of believability in universe, I don't really see anything wrong with it, and I'm just going to give it a straight 10 out of 10 for believability. I can clearly see this fitting in alongside some of the other Rahi, like the Metru Mantis or the Nui Jaga here, and it definitely scales nicely compared to the other humanoid characters too. But setting these aside, it's time to take a look at how this model stacks up for the other points. So I want to start off with posability. So posability wise, I was fairly happy with the amount of different poses you could get this into. As I mentioned before, you can really choose to have the tail laid back, have it upwards in a striking motion, and really wiggle the legs around. The only kind of downside that I had was that if your joints are weak, the claws just will not stay up. They will keep on wanting to fall because the claws are very heavy for the way they're mounted. And in addition, while it's not a major con, this absolutely cannot hold its own weight. You can't really get it off the ground, it will just fall right down. So if that bothers you, that is definitely a con. Personally, it doesn't bother me as much as it would for, say, a creature that absolutely needs to be raised off the ground. Like, for example, if a humanoid was continuously falling down, then we'd have a problem. But since this is just a Rahi, I'm generally okay with it just kind of resting on the ground. And so, I'm going to give posability a 7 out of 10. It certainly isn't perfect, you can't move the head at all, and the claws will just droop down, but you can actually get this into fairly decent poses, which at the end of the day is really all that matters. Moving on to building techniques, as I mentioned throughout the review, I was very impressed with just how this all came together, especially with the construction on the bottom and underside of the torso here to really include different types of pieces throughout, as well as the fact that, again, this doesn't really take anything from Bionicle sets and just reuses it. Everything here is pretty unique. The only thing basically reused are segments of Rakshi legs, which are modified to the point where they really stand out as something different, with all these brown colored armoring all around it. And finally, we can talk about aesthetics. So overall, I'm pretty happy with the aesthetics of this. I love the inclusion of the tan Technic pin to axle converters here, which really give it like a ridged look and feel, and especially because they're in tan, it does really help with the color scheme of the general brown and dark orange, the earthy colors of this model. And I think in general, the color blocking is quite good. The use of dark orange, brown, some of these silver bits, but just for the spiky aspects of it, didn't go too overboard with the silver, and even some orange bits and pieces here and there to really give some highlight color to this model, really do feel like it all comes together quite well. And I'm very happy with this aesthetically speaking because, again, I can immediately look at this and think of it as some kind of a scorpion Rahi. And so I'm going to give aesthetics a 8 out of 10 as well. I'm pretty happy with how this looks in general, and I'm very pleased with the overall composition of this model as a whole. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments below if you've built this yourselves, what do you think of this? And if so, what do you think of the model as a whole and how it compares to some of the other Rahi in the G1 universe? This is one of the better or best canonized Bionicle Rahi models, so I definitely recommend checking it out and maybe even building it if you have the right pieces. But that about sums up this review. Thank you so much for tuning into Duckbricks, and stay tuned for a new Bionicle Fanon review coming every single Monday, unless otherwise stated. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and bye-bye for now.